But where exactly has China threatened the United States? We're afraid that many Americans have no answer to that. For many Washington elites, China's development and the Chinese people's desire for a better life are a kind of original sin, because in Washington's memory, wealth is accumulated through plunder and slaughter. These are strong words, and as I said, they come from Global Times, and they follow on from what Xingang is saying. I have to say that I read all of this with extraordinary concern. It looks to me, and I get to say this bluntly, that, as I said, there's many different factions fighting it out in Washington about the direction of US policy in Ukraine. It seemed to me that Haynes, at least the Director of National Intelligence, is trying to hedge. She's trying to say, well, on the one hand, the Russians are almost out of ammunition. They're not able to advance. But on the other hand, we're not convinced that Ukraine will be able to advance either. But at the same time, she's setting up the Chinese for blame in case the Russians do, contrary to what she says, manage and advance in Ukraine. And this, of course, coming on top of all the vitriolic comments about China that we now see, and also reports that Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, is about to visit Taiwan, following in the footsteps of his Democrat predecessor, Nancy Pelosi, who also visited Taiwan, provoking huge anger in China just a few months ago. So the Chinese are seeing all of this. They're seeing how the United States is seeking to contain them, is seeking to suffocate their economic development through trying to stop, for example, the export of high-end chip technology to China, something that the Chinese are responding to. In fact, there's a lot of information recently about the fact that the Chinese are actually ahead of the United States in the greater number of technologies. I'm not going to discuss that in this program. I'm hardly an expert in that field. But anyway, the Chinese are clearly exasperated. They see the United States actively working to set up a confrontation in Taiwan. They ask, as the Global Times article does, rather plaintively, well, how are we threatening the United States? We've always said that Taiwan was part of our territory. We've never changed our stance over Taiwan. We're not considering any threats against the United States or against any US allies. We might have disputes over islands with some of them, but we're always prepared to sit down and talk about them. And yet, despite the fact that we are not threatening the United States seems to be spoiling for a fight with us. And Chinese Foreign Minister Xingang is now saying that the situation is deteriorating, that there's no sign that the United States is capable of compromise with China. The Chinese have undoubtedly seen how the United States has stirred up the whole issue of the prospect or possibility of Chinese ammunition supplies to Russia, something which the Chinese have said they have no plan to do, that the US has been using that story in order to put pressure on its European allies to impose sanctions on China. And the Chinese are drawing conclusions. They're saying that we're heading towards confrontation. And in light of this, unless this train of confrontation, a brake is placed on it in the United States, a confrontation with the United States now looks inevitable. Now, given that this is the view that the Chinese have made, and notice how Xingang makes the point that the incident with the balloon has crystallized thinking in Beijing, that the Chinese found the American response over the balloon so over the top, so completely irrational, that it demonstrated the extent of visceral anti-Chinese sentiment, which, as far as the Chinese are concerned, has now gained hold in Washington. The Chinese are saying to themselves, well, given that realistically the US is not going to change direction, we have no real option but to prepare our defenses. And in fact, over the last few days, China has announced a big increase in defense spending by 7%. And I have to say, with Xi Jinping heading towards Moscow, and with a flurry of headlines now in the international media about how China and Russia are drawing even closer together, I can't help but think that with the Chinese having concluded that a confrontation of some kind with the United States is now inevitable, and with the Chinese also having concluded that a sanctions war against China is an inevitable part of that as well, that from the Chinese point of view, there is now no real incentive against supplying the Russians with ammunition, if that is what the Russians need. And there might even before long be a positive incentive to do so, given how, as I've discussed before, the war in Ukraine is absorbing US energies, depleting Western arsenals, weakening the US potentially in advance of a confrontation with China. Now, I have to say, this is all looking rather dark, and perhaps it is, but we have seen how the Chinese, as I said, are now responding to this campaign that they see coming out of the United States. Now, all I'm going to say is this: if one effect of this campaign is indeed to cause the Chinese to supply ammunition to the Russians, I'm not saying the Russians need it or want it, I'm not saying that the Chinese are planning to provide it, but if pressure from the United States causes the Chinese to think that it might be a good idea to do that, and I'm starting to see how they might think that, and it's important to say that in public comments made recently, they have not ruled it out. If that's what the Chinese do, and if they do it because of American pressure, and if we have a sanctions war at a time when the Western economies are already apparently edging towards recession, and when inflation in all the major Western economies is already rising, then all I can say is we have further proof that whom the gods destroy, they first make mad.